I've said that non-duality has become trendy. It's become fashionable to talk about non-duality. And as part of this scenario, this entire culture around non-duality, there's the concept of no self or non-self. And if you look at some of these videos that are out there, again, you can very quickly become confused because some of these ideas about no self, quite frankly, don't make any sense. They are nonsensical. So let's try to see if we can make some kind of sense out of this concept of no self. Now, the first thing we can do, which is fairly simple to do, is to realize that there is no state of no self or non-self. You are a human being, or rather, you are a spiritual being. You are a conscious being. And what makes you conscious is that you have a sense of self. You can never escape that. You are not meant to escape that. So why are there people who say, I'm in a state of no self. I have attained no self. I have attained ego death. I am enlightened. I am awakened. Well, listen to what they're saying. I. What is the I that has no self? It's a self. You're always going to have a self. The question is not, do I have a self or do I have no self? The question is, what kind of a self do I have? And as I've explained in my previous videos about non-duality, the real question or the real choice we have is, do we see ourselves as connected beings who are connected to something outside our own minds? Or do we go into the state of separation and duality where our minds become closed systems, self-referential systems, because we think that from inside of our mind, we can know everything there is to know about how the universe functions. So we don't need anything from outside our own mind. That's also why we think we can go into this state of no self, where we're not connected to anything. It's just there's no self. So how have this entire concept of non-self or no self, how has this come about? Well, if you look at it historically in the East, you have the Vedic teachings that became the foundation for the Hindu religion and later became the foundation for teachings called Advaita Vedanta or even Neo-Advaita. There are various teachings about this. And if you look at the Vedas, the one aspect of the Vedas that relates to a sense of self is that the Vedas say that there is an Atman, which is the ultimate sense of self, the universal sense of self. But the Vedas also say that this is a permanent, non-changing self. So some of these concepts are found in the Upanishads, which came out about 2,800 years ago. So then 2,500 years ago, the Buddha enters the stage. And he denied not that there is no self. Be very careful here. The Buddha didn't say there's no self. He said there is no permanent, unchanging self. And that led to a concept which in Buddhism is referred to as anatta, which loosely translated means no self. But the Buddha never said that there is either an Atman or there is no self. He said there is a changing self, a growing self, an evolving self. Now some will deny this, even some Buddhist teachings will deny this, but you look at the Buddha. First of all, you have to realize there is an enormous idolatry built up around the Buddha just as there is around Jesus. If you grew up in the West, you have been fed this idolatry that Jesus was so special because of all these circumstances around his birth and his life and this and that. But they have the same thing about the Buddha. And there are some that want to make it seem like he was the perfect being, and if he was the perfect being, he must have been born enlightened. But if you look at the history about the Buddha's life, he wasn't born enlightened. He was born in a certain state of consciousness, and then through various steps he grew until he reached enlightenment and then started teaching. So the Buddha's life actually demonstrates a path from lower states of consciousness towards higher states of consciousness. So there's growth, there's evolution. So what the Buddha taught about the concept of the self is that the self is an evolving self. It's not permanent, it's not unchanging, and it wasn't created in a perfect state that it has to return to. In other words, the Buddha didn't say, once upon a time, you were created as a self and you were created in a perfect state. You have forgotten that perfect state and you need to return to it. That's not what the Buddha said. He taught a teaching very similar to what I gave in my first two talks, especially the second talk about non-duality, where I say that we started out with a point-like sense of self, and what we were created for is to gradually increase that sense of self until we reach the same level of consciousness as the Creator that created us. The Creator didn't personally create you and I. We were created by spiritual beings in the realm right above Earth. But nevertheless, we are part of the lineage that reaches all the way to the Creator, because the only reason we have self-awareness is that we are an individualization, an extension of the Creator's being, the one mind. There is only one mind. So if you look at the concept of the Atman in this way, then it's valid enough. I mean, there is one mind that is the basis for all of the individual selves, all of the individual minds that we are. But we are not the fullness of that mind. We weren't created with the fullness of that mind. We had the potential to grow, to realize that fullness. And that's what the spiritual path and the path to enlightenment and awakening is all about. But you are not going to reach enlightenment or awakening by striving to have no self. You can see some teachings out there that make it seem like the ultimate goal of spiritual growth is to have no self. That's a misinterpretation. And where does it come from? Well, it partly comes from the Western mindset, which is very black and white. We have a tendency to think in black and white terms, and it actually goes back, as I've talked about in some of my other videos, all the way to Aristotle in ancient Greece, who came up with this concept of the excluded middle. In other words, a statement, it's either true or it's not true. There's nothing in between. There's only true and untrue. Now, as I've explained, this is the classical dualistic pairing, the pairs that the Buddha talked about. Wants to make everything seem like it's clear-cut, it's either this or that. So what has happened is that after this, especially in modern times, but even during Buddhist times actually, that people who are in this mindset, this black and white thinking, they have looked at what the Buddha said about non-self and have interpreted it to mean that the Buddha denied that there's any kind of self. But he didn't deny that. In fact, the Buddha actually, and you can find this on the internet if you search for it, the Buddha actually said he warned against going into a state of no self where you're experiencing nothingness, because this doesn't lead to ultimate growth. And so what has happened is that people in this black and white mindset, they have interpreted the Buddha's remarks where he said there's no permanent, unchanging self, and they have taken this to the extreme and saying that means there must be no self. And that means that ultimately we need to strive to come to a state where we have no self, no sense of self. And this is not what the Buddha intended. But of course, as I said about non-duality, is a very challenging concept. And the concept of no self is also challenging because there's more to say about it. In a sense, you could say that what I've said so far, that we can never be in a state where we have no self, you could say that sounds black and white. So there are nuances. So let's look at those. So what I said in the first two videos is there are basically two states of mind for a human being on Earth. We can see ourselves as connected beings, and we can strive to increase that connection. or we can see ourselves as separate beings. And in order to see ourselves as separate beings, we go into a specific state of consciousness that I call the duality consciousness. And I also said that you cannot really grasp what non-duality is about unless you have a very clear and deep understanding of the duality consciousness and how it affects everything we say or think, or the way we look at life. Our entire worldview, the way we were brought up, is based on the duality consciousness, seeing ourselves as separate beings, separate from other people, separate from our physical environment, separate from our source. So the real goal of spiritual growth, at least at a certain stage, is to overcome this duality consciousness, where we reclaim our sense of being connected to something outside our own minds. And what are we connected to? Well, each of us has a higher self. The Ascended Masters call it the I Am Presence, because it's what gives us a sense that I am, I exist. Now, if you are a strict believer in non-self, you'll say, oh, that's an illusion. That's just another kind of false self. But is it? It's actually the dualistic sense of self that's the false self. And your I Am Presence is the true self, because your I Am Presence exists in the spiritual realm. And therefore, it cannot be affected by the duality consciousness. The I Am Presence can never go into duality. But the I Am Presence also can never go into embodiment in the physical universe, in the material universe. So that's why the I Am Presence has sent an extension of itself into embodiment. And that's what I have explained in several videos. I call it the conscious you, or the conscious self. You can call it whatever you want. But this conscious you is the basic for any kind of mystical experience that people have ever had. Millions and millions of people have experienced this. It's also what you can call a non-dual experience, where what I've explained is that the conscious you, over a long period of time, over many embodiments, we have been forced to react to conditions on Earth. And Earth is an unnatural planet. There's a lot of conflict, and we have to react to this. We are forced to react to this. And in order to react to it, once we go into duality, we create these selves, these subconscious selves. And they're based on the sense that we're separate beings. So all of these selves, they pull on the conscious you. And they pull the conscious you into seeing itself as a separate being. And when we go below a certain level of consciousness, we lose that conscious awareness that we have a higher self. So what can actually happen is that we are beginning to awaken from the duality consciousness. We are beginning to have perhaps even these experiences of stepping outside our normal worldview, our normal way of looking at life. So we have some genuine non-dual experiences. You can find videos where you can see people have had a dramatic, what they call an awakening experience. But unfortunately, they think, now this is permanent. Now they are fully awakened because they had this dramatic experience. I can tell you based on my experience that that's not the case. You can have all kinds of dramatic experiences, but it's just the beginning of the process of awakening. So what happens is that people have an experience, but now when they are out of the experience again, they go back into their normal perception filter, their normal worldview. And now they are interpreting the mystical experience through the dualistic worldview. And they are superimposing upon it what they can see from the dualistic worldview. So what can happen is that here you still have a lot of dualistic selves in your subconscious mind, and you are not aware of this. You have a dramatic experience where the conscious you steps outside of all these dualistic selves. It experiences that there's a whole different way to look at the world, a non-dual way to look at the world. It's profoundly affected by this, moved by it, shocked by it. But then, of course, the experience subsides. You go back into your normal state of awareness. If you're not aware that you have this dualistic worldview and these dualistic selves, these selves will desperately, some call it the ego, I call it a number of separate selves that make up the ego, but anyway, they'll desperately want you to take that experience and fit it into your dualistic worldview so that it doesn't become the foundation for you overcoming all of these selves. They don't want to die, and they can only die if you don't see them and let them die. So they have to pull you into thinking that your non-dual experience can and should be interpreted through the dualistic consciousness. And this is what causes some people to say, well, what I experienced was a state of no self, because I felt like I had no self. So this must mean that in my normal state of awareness, I have a sense of self. It causes me suffering, causes me all of these problems. So I must strive to have no self, and that is the ultimate state of spiritual awakening. So what you see here is a typical outcome of the duality consciousness. Now, the duality consciousness has this black and white thinking, which means something is either true or untrue. But the duality consciousness also has a concept of something ultimate. No, it's implied in something is either true or untrue is that which is true is the ultimate truth. So the way the duality consciousness looks at spiritual teachings and spiritual concepts is, I have to find the ultimate spiritual teaching, the ultimate guru, the ultimate spiritual concept. So this is what caused, and this goes back quite far, even to some of the early Buddhist teachings and some of the Vedantic teachings, this has caused some people to interpret everything in these black and white terms. There has to be an extreme, an ultimate spiritual teaching, an ultimate spiritual understanding. And this is what caused them to go into this, the Buddha stated in the First Noble Truth, life is suffering. So there are some people that say, why are we suffering? Because we have a state of self. So the way to escape suffering is to have no self. And so they think this means that you have to strive to attain this state of no self. But as I said, the question is not whether you have a self or no self. There is a self that causes you to suffer, and that's the dualistic self based on the illusion of separation. A separate self can only suffer. There can be periods of elation where now you think you are the master of the universe because you have raised this separate self to some ultimate status, and that's what some spiritual people are striving for. But there is always the two polarities. For every high there's a low, and the higher the high, the lower the low. So this is using the duality consciousness to interpret a non-dual experience. What you have when the conscious you steps outside of all of these subconscious selves, the separate selves, is you have a sense of connection. But the question is, how aware are you of that connection and what you are connected to? And so I understand, because I've experienced it myself, that when you step outside of all these separate selves, I understand you can feel like, I don't have a self. Because you don't have the kind of self that you're used to. You don't have the dualistic self, the separate self. And it can, I admit, be very confusing, very disorienting. And I know there are people who have had this in a more dramatic fashion where they've almost lost their sense of continuity, almost lost their sense of identity. And I explained in one of my previous videos that when I was 19, I took this meditation course. We had some Vedic teachings. I have had a lot of non-dual experiences. And I was very disoriented and confused when I came back to real life. And so I understand it. I would say that for 2 or 3 years, I was probably in this state that some people call a state of no self. I understand what they're talking about. And understand that the experience feels very real. But it actually isn't. It's just a temporary phase. And actually, it's much better for us if we don't go into that kind of a dramatic experience, but we grow very gradually on the path so we don't lose our sense of continuity. And this is what I've experienced ever since. As I said, I found the Ascended Master teachings 3 or 4 years after that experience, and that put me on a path where I have grown gradually. I haven't gone through these dramatic swings, so I haven't lost my sense of continuity, my sense of who I am. I've just gradually transcended the sense of self I had and reached a higher sense of self. That's a non-dual sense of self. I'm not saying it's totally non-dual, but it's definitely very different than what I had those many years ago. So what I'm saying is that ideally, the spiritual path should be this very gradual growth. So we don't lose our sense of continuity, but we are transcending our sense of self. And as we rise higher on this path, we get rid of all these dualistic selves, and we gradually shift to a non-dual view of life. But if you have a dramatic experience where you're suddenly outside of these separate selves and experience a non-dual state of awareness, then once you come back into a normal state of awareness, it's very, very difficult to deal with this. It's really schizophrenic. And unfortunately, the psychological profession, of course, isn't aware of this, so where are you going to get help from this? There may be some spiritual teachers, if you are fortunate, that can help you through it, but there isn't much out there about it. So many of us who have gone through these kind of experiences, we are the pioneers. We are the forerunners. We have to literally go through these experiences and try to work it out and find some kind of balance, make some kind of sense out of this, so that we can hopefully gradually help other people going through it. So I'm not discounting people's experiences. I'm just saying that based on my experience, I realized that the goal of spiritual growth is not to attain a state of non-self. The goal is to attain a non-dual state of self, and then from that point continue to expand your sense of self. As I said in the previous video, your real goal is to eventually on Earth to reach the highest level of consciousness possible on Earth, so you can ascend from Earth. You don't have to reincarnate on this very dense planet. And then when you become an ascended being, you can keep rising up through many levels of awareness until you reach the greater consciousness. You are not going to shift. You are not ever, when you are an embodied being on Earth, whether you are the Buddha or Jesus or some Indian guru, you are not going to reach the highest level of awareness that's possible. This is another illusion that springs from this black and white thinking. Because you want to think, that when the Buddha, for example, talks about enlightenment or awakening, this is an ultimate state of consciousness. And this is what it led some of these modern non-dual teachers to talk about. There's only the separate self, and there is infinite awareness. And infinite awareness manifested itself as the separate self and then forgot its infinite awareness, but when we reawaken, we go back to infinite awareness. But that's, again, a dualistic, black and white misinterpretation of the teachings. Because awakening does not mean you lose your sense of self. Awakening on a planet like Earth does not mean you reach the ultimate state of consciousness that could ever be reached. This is a really dangerous misinterpretation. Because look at the planet you're on. We are on. As I've said before, it's a hell of a planet. Very low state of collective consciousness. Very dense planet, dense consciousness, dense matter. You really think you can jump from this planet to the highest state of awareness possible? Or that you can attain it while you're still in a physical body? I mean, come on, get real. Just take a look around. This is really the ultimate state of the duality consciousness. And so this is another thing to look at. Okay, I have in some of my How the World Works videos talked about certain beings that rebelled against the process of self-transcendence. They believed they had reached such a sophisticated sense of self, created such a sophisticated sense of self, that it should be allowed to enter the spiritual realm. It should become immortalized. But the self they had created was based on the duality consciousness. And it can never enter the spiritual realm. It can never be immortalized. It can never become permanent. It can never happen. But these beings then rebelled and they fell to a lower level. I've explained this whole process in my first video of how the world was created. And they have now, ever since then, they don't want to admit that this was a mistake. So ever since then, they've tried to perfect this separate self, make it more and more sophisticated. So this is one dualistic extreme. But the problem is when you take this approach, because the universe is a mirror, you are projecting certain things into the cosmic mirror that the cosmic mirror will reflect back to you, and this will cause you suffering. So the separate self can only suffer because it sees itself in opposition to the physical environment it's in, to other people in that environment, and to its source, to God or the ascended masters, however it conceives of it. So the separate self is always in a conflict with somebody. And this leads to stress and suffering. Now, what's the flip side of wanting to elevate the separate self to an ultimate status? What is the other dualistic extreme? It's to deny that there's a self. So you either have the godlike self or no self. And that's what these beings have created. Now, in order to really understand how this works, you have to understand, as I've explained in my videos again, that there are 4 levels of the material world that we're in. There's the purely physical material level, our physical bodies. There's the emotional level corresponding to our feelings, our feeling bodies, or the feeling level of the mind. There's the mental level and the identity level. And what I have explained in these videos is that we human beings, we can, in our own minds, in our emotional, mental, identity bodies, we can create these selves based on separation. But we also, when we do this, we create collective selves. So we human beings have created collective selves in the energy field of this planet. And they can have a deep influence on people. For example, addictions. There's an alcohol entity or self that pulls on people who have a tendency to become addicted to alcohol and pulls them into addiction and makes it very difficult for them to get out of it because they have to overcome that pull. So there are many other of these selves. Some cells pull people into war, and many other things. So what we have to realize here is that over time, started with these beings who fell, but also with many human beings, there are these collective selves that have been created in the energy field of Earth. And one of them is this belief that you can elevate one person to some ultimate status. You see that in dictatorships, you see it with spiritual gurus. Jesus and the Buddha, they were subjected to this after they graduated from the planet. And so there is that collective self that wants to elevate something to an ultimate status, but the other collective self is the state of no self or non-self, which denies that there is a self. And some people have taken this and they have clothed it, they have disguised it as a spiritual teaching that says, oh, it's the highest form of spiritual teaching is to attain the state of no self, because that's the only way to escape suffering. But it's not. What causes suffering is not that you have a sense of self. It's that you have a sense of separate self, a dualistic self. This is what creates suffering. And in order to escape suffering, you don't have to have no self. You have to have a sense of being connected to something outside your own mind to begin with. And eventually, as you go higher on the spiritual path, you have a connection to your higher self, and you eventually even overcome the sense that you are connected to your higher self. You realize, you experience, you are an extension of the higher self. You are actually the higher self here on earth. But you know that you're not the fullness of the higher self, because the higher self is in the spiritual realm, but still you are an extension of it. And so, if you really want to grasp the concept of no self, you have to really understand the duality consciousness and how it always seeks to pervert everything and create these 2 extremes. And the concept of non-self has been run through this mill of the duality consciousness, and there's been created this entire, what can you call it, a subculture almost, that the ultimate state of spiritual growth is to have no self. But this is a total denial of the purpose of creation. It's a total denial of why you exist. As I said, you were created as a co-creator with the Creator. You were sent into this material universe to co-create and thereby help raise the material universe to a higher state, to spiritualize everything, we might say. Why is this? Because you gain experience by going through this process, and this can help you decide what you want to do when you reach the creator consciousness yourself. Do I want to create a creation? How do I want to formulate it? What form should it take? Because you now have experience with what makes a creation work, what makes it self-destruct. And so, if you are denying that entire purpose for why you exist, how can that be the ultimate spiritual understanding? It's just nonsense. It's a false teaching. It's a false interpretation, deliberately created to confuse those people who are close to waking up. You have to realize, and again I explain this in some of my other videos, there is a force on earth that doesn't want people to awaken from duality. It wants everybody to remain in the duality consciousness, because then there is a few beings who can control the population. It's all about control. These beings, I've called them fallen beings. They exist both in physical embodiment, in the emotional realm, the mental realm, and the identity realm. They feel they're in control of Earth. In reality, they're not, but they feel they are, and they want to maintain that control. They're willing to do anything they can to do it. They also know that the biggest threat to their control are the people who are beginning to awaken from the duality consciousness. So they do everything they can to either prevent people from awakening or to guide people into a blind alley where they think they are spiritual, but they're having a slightly distorted view. That means they're going into a blind alley. And the idea of non-self, meaning you have no self at all, is one of these blind alleys. Very subtle, very clever, but it's meant to catch those people who actually are close to waking up and therefore could potentially help raise the earth to a higher state. And if you don't realize that, you can end up being very, very confused. This is exactly the state I was in when I was 19, 20, 21, 22. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was totally in limbo. I mean, spiritual. I was totally in limbo. I had had certain experiences that felt very real, but the context, the teaching that I had them in, couldn't help me make sense of it. In fact, it pulled me in the wrong direction. It didn't actually have a concept of no self at the time, but still, it left me very, very confused. And so, if you've gone through something similar, I would very strongly recommend that you consider some of these ideas I put out here. If you have actually watched this video up to this point, it must be because there is something in you that wanted you to watch this. And so carefully consider what that means. I'm not saying you should take my word for it, but at least consider this and see what you get from your higher self. But however, I know this is difficult, because what's the effect if you really go into this state of non-self, where you log into this collective state of non-self that's been created, you allow this into your mind? What do? You are denying that you have a higher self. Because you think it's either the separate self you have here on earth, or it's infinite awareness, or Brahman, or the enlightened state. Nothing in between. So why would you have a higher self that exists in the spiritual realm, that's sort of an intermediary between you and whatever you see as the ultimate level of awareness? You think you can switch directly from the separate self to infinite awareness, or whatever you call it. So you're actually denying that you have a higher self. So how are you going to hear the directions from your higher self? How are you going to feel a stream of energy from your higher self? I look at some of these videos that are out there, and there's these people who talk about a state of non-self. And they talk in this monotone, emotionless tone of voice. It's almost like, and if you look at them, you can sense there's no output from them. There's no energy in their auras. There's no radiation. But where does the radiation come from? It comes from your higher self. I can of my own self do nothing, as Jesus said. But if you deny that you have a higher self, your higher self must respect your free will and step back and let you have that experience you apparently want to have of being a separate being and not having a higher self until you can't stand it anymore. What option does the higher self have? The higher self will never violate your free will. The fallen beings, the dark beings, they'll violate your free will, but the ascended masters and your own I am presence, they will not violate your free will. So this is what has confused a lot of people. They don't realize that if you allow yourself to be pulled into these false teachings, then the ascended masters and the I am presence, because they respect free will, they have to step back and allow you to have that experience. I've talked about the school of hard knocks, right? And we would like to think that once we have found the spiritual path and the spiritual teaching, we are not in the school of hard knocks anymore. I thought that way for many years. But I have realized that it's not the case. You can find a spiritual teaching and you can actually allow your dualistic selves to use the spiritual teaching to reinforce the worldview that keeps you in the school of hard knocks. Because now you think you are a very, very spiritual person. You have the highest spiritual understanding. You have had these very powerful non-dual experiences. But you are interpreting it all through that dualistic state of mind, the very subtle remnants of duality that you have left. And that's why you cut yourself off from what is meant to be your frame of reference that helps you escape non-duality. Look at it this way. What I've said in some of my videos is, when you go into duality, your mind becomes a closed, self-referential system. Your mind has certain things that it elevates to the status. This is an absolute truth. This is something I don't need to question. You find a spiritual teaching, it has to fit into that worldview. It cannot question those spiritual holy cows that you have that are untouchable. So you are taking the teaching, fitting it into this dualistic worldview. And what does that mean? It means now you are actually reducing or cutting off the connection to something outside your own mind. What is outside your own mind? Well, there's your higher self, your I am presence, but there's also the ascended masters who serve as the spiritual teachers for humankind. What is the main purpose of these? It is to serve as a frame of reference to show you, oh, there's something outside my own mind. There's a reality outside of my own mind that's more real than the viewpoints I have in my own mind, the dualistic selves. And when you have that frame of reference and use it, you can use it to question not only these selves, but the dualistic illusions that they are based on. So you can come to see, oh, but that thing that I thought was an absolute truth that I never needed to question, it's actually an illusion. I've done this so many times in the past 47 years. I had things that I thought, oh, this I definitely understood, and this is just the way it is. And still I had to question it, and I had to realize, maybe it wasn't completely wrong, but it could be seen from a wider perspective. It was just one piece in a much larger context. And when I saw that larger context, I got a whole different view of it. But if you are not willing to reach for something outside your own mind, if you want everything to fit into the perception filter that you already have, you're cutting off that, because the ascended masters and your higher self will not violate your free will. The dark beings and other people, they'll violate your free will. They'll try to force themselves into their mind or confuse you with something. But the ascended masters will never do that. And that's why there are many spiritual people who don't realize they are ascended masters, don't realize they have a higher self, because they don't grasp the significance of having that frame of reference. Because they're still trapped in this thinking, oh, I can work this out in my own mind, I can figure this out. You cannot, let me just tell you, you cannot escape the duality consciousness by using the duality consciousness. Einstein said, you cannot overcome a problem through the same state of consciousness that created the problem. He also said, if you keep doing the same thing and expect that one day you will get a different result, you are insane. So the duality consciousness is a form of insanity, because we think that by continuing to look at the world through the dualistic state of mind, we can escape the dualistic state of mind and reach a non-dual state of mind. This cannot be done. It never has been done, and it never will be done. I don't care what spiritual teachers you might idolize, what teachers you look at from the past. Nobody ever escaped the duality consciousness by using the duality consciousness. Everybody needed something from outside their own minds in order to be free of the duality consciousness. Jesus said it clearly, I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, he doeth the work. The Buddha also talked about something beyond duality, beyond the pairs, which he called the Buddha nature, which is within everyone. So the reality is, and this is again, I know this sounds contradictory, but the reality here is, we need something from outside our own minds in order to escape the duality consciousness. But where do we find that something? Well, we find it inside our own minds. Only we don't find it inside the dualistic minds. We find it when the conscious you steps outside of the dualistic mind. But it is important to realize it doesn't come from an external source. We can benefit from having an external guru and an external teaching, yes. But ultimately, spiritual growth means making greater and greater contact, attaining greater and greater oneness with the real spiritual teachers, the ascended masters, and with your higher self, your I am presence. Until you can come and say, first you say, I am that I am up there. This is the meaning in the New Testament, I am that I am. It actually means I am that I am. I'm not the separate self down here. I'm actually the spiritual self in the spiritual realm. But then you come to say, I am the presence. And then eventually you come to say, I am presence. Because you no longer experience a distance, a separation from the presence. But this doesn't mean you have no self. You still have the conscious you, and the conscious you will be there until you ascend and reunite with the I am presence. And as such, you are still a self. You are making choices. You are responsible for those choices. You are evaluating situations. You are evaluating, should I react through one of these separate selves, or should I expose the separate self and overcome it so I don't react? All of these evaluations, I can say that I've lost a lot of my dualistic selves, but I don't claim to have no self, because I'm still responsible for what I do with my life while I'm in physical embodiment. I'm responsible for how I spend my time, what I focus my attention on, the choices I make, and the consequences of those choices. And, this leads to another topic, which is free will. Do we have free will? And what happens to free will as we walk the spiritual path? And to my surprise, I found that after having read about the scientific materialists for decades who have denied that we have free will, to my surprise realized that there are some of these teachers of non-duality who claim that we have no free will. And so that's a topic I'll also talk about in a coming video. But I hope this has been useful to some people, so you can see through the nonsensical aspects of the concept of non-self.